We're with Itai Nixon from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Director of Economic Affairs. Hello, Itai.
Hi, Maala.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The quite, I would say, unprecedented announcement of the Ministry of funding for Israeli companies to publish ESG reports. The emphasis is on in English. This is a bold step, I think, forward in terms of ESG reporting in Israel. So can you sort of explain what's going on in that regard?
Definitely, yes. So the Israeli government and the ministry has known for some time that CSR practices in Israel by Israeli companies are advanced and are at a good point. But that isn't necessarily translated into English and shown to the rest of the world or shown to investors around the world. And we know that international investors or investments in ESG, or according to responsible investing, is growing. And they're interested in that aspect. And we want to encourage Israeli companies to start reporting in English to show the good things that they're doing in order to engage with these international investors.
And we know for years that there's a gap in terms of transparency in Israel. I mean, we know that there's a famous joke in Israel that everybody knows everything, but doesn't necessarily know it formally.
Yes.
ESG reporting is definitely a tool we know that international ESG investors use. There's a gap here. How much more reports do we expect sort of as a result of that step?
We're hoping to at least double the amount of reporting next year. So on average, there's about 20 companies, 20 large companies who put out CSR reports or ESG reports a year. And we're hoping to double that and maybe even more within the first year. And we're hoping just to start. We're hoping it's just the pilot. We want to try and encourage many more companies to report and try and get that number to really grow. You're right. The Israeli economy, or Israel in general, is not as formal as a lot of other let's say Western countries. I've heard from one investor saying, we don't need this because if we have a question, we just pick up the phone, call the CEO, ask him a question, and we know everything.
Yeah.
But we understand that's not always the best approach if you're a large investor from a European country, that's not something that you'll be able to do.
Right. And you expect a report that you can go through. And then if you have an additional question, you'll call the company. But we want to start with something tangible, something formal in your hands. You've chosen, I would say, a soft regulation kind of approach. You could have, I don't know if you could have, but the more typical approach that we see in recent years is sort of a company as a state regulation, demanding of companies to publish ESG reports. You have taken a sort of a different approach. Was that sort of intentional? Was that sort of a way that you believe will work better in the Israeli market?
Yes, well, it's definitely intentional. I think the Israeli government as a whole and our ministry understands that regulations is one approach, and it's a very legitimate approach. But the government for years now has been trying to cut back on regulations and try and get things going on voluntarily where it could happen. So the Securities Commission or Securities Authority, who's been looking into this for quite some time, is also adopting a more voluntary approach because we don't want to add more regulations on companies. There's enough regulations going on, especially with COVID going around the economic situation at the moment. We think a more positive approach, a more approach where companies buy in and understand the value of reporting and do it themselves is way more valuable than doing something just because there's some kind of regulation or compulsion of doing it. If you actually do it because you buy in and you believe in it, we think it'll be way more effective, and it'll also more internalized within the company itself. And like I said before, there's a lot of regulations in Israel that set a framework for high level of CSR compliance, and we think because we know we're at that stage, because we know that companies can show that they're doing well and doing good, that we want them to actually do that. We want to encourage them to do that. So that could be some funding, which is not, it's not a world-changing funding for a lot of these companies. We're talking about very large companies in Israel. But we know that by signaling this to the market and with other signals from other governmental institutions, such as the Securities Authority or other ministries, we're hoping that there'll be a more proactive approach and a more voluntary approach by companies to start reporting in English.
Yeah. And we've definitely, by the way, I mean, from the questions that we've got from our corporate members, we definitely saw how that announcement, how that sort of potential funding has, I would say, made the last kind of push towards deciding, let's do it. And that's the power of kind of a voluntary action, I would say.
Yeah, I think what we did was signal to the market that the government thinks it's important. That and some other things that other government authorities have done it. So again, a company that wasn't thinking about it initially, maybe starting to think about it now, and a company that was closer debating, this may have, like you said, pushed them over the edge and helped them take that extra step.
Yeah, that last mile kind of step that they need to take. You've mentioned it, but just to give a clearer picture, in terms of ESG regulation in Israel, we know that, again, if you look for a specific ESG regulation in Israel, you wouldn't find it. However, you've mentioned that there are lots of areas covered, sort of drilling down the various fields that sort of make ESG.
Yeah, the regulatory framework in Israel, or the laws, are they're very clear. So labor laws, labor inclusion laws, environmental protection laws that are starting to advance more and more. Israel's at the forefront, and we know that. And we know that when it comes to the way companies have to act because of these regulations, they're already there. And they do a lot more. We also know that companies do a lot more than just the regulation. If we talked about before about the buy-in and the voluntary aspect of it, we know that the regulatory framework is set. We want the companies to show what they're doing to the international community, to the investors in English.
Right. And that's definitely sort of an asset. Summing up, I think that, the ministry is also in charge of public diplomacy. And I think through the years, we've been doing some projects together as well. We have seen a very proactive approach to help that engagement, to help the dialogue between international investors or international businesses looking for more information or looking for more, I would say, connections in Israel. That's, again, I would say this is relatively unique. Maybe it's part of, Israel's situation. But what's the strategy behind that?
So we've identified some gaps. So a lot of times, there's the language barrier, obviously. So some companies, the market in Israel is conducted in Hebrew.
Right.
So the first step is the language barrier. That's why we've asked them to report in English. But the second step is actually identifying who's approaching you and knowing that, the person approaching you is asking legitimate questions from an investor's perspective, and they want some answers. And a lot of times, Israeli companies, or not a lot of times, but sometimes Israeli companies didn't know to identify that. And we tried to fill that gap, to try and foster this engagement between an investor who's got legitimate questions and wants to understand a certain issue, and the company on the other side, so they would actually sit down and talk about the issues. We can't fill the gap by providing the information. The government can't speak for a company, and even if we try, the investor won't accept that because the company needs to speak for itself. So by doing that in the past, so we've tried to foster a lot of engagement. I think this next step now of encouraging reporting is advancing that a step further, because beyond just trying to connect the two sides and getting them to talk to understand, we understand there's not only a language barrier, there's also a terminology barrier. A lot of companies don't necessarily speak the international language of ESG. Right. They can speak in Hebrew, but they don't necessarily speak in English, or it's different. Yeah. So once they get that ability, we hope that engagement will be even more productive.
Right. So you're definitely helping in sort of building the market, getting accustomed to the language and to sort of those expectations on behalf of of global markets. Yeah. And that's, again, as I've said before, I think it's very sort of smart sort of regulatory action in a market, as we know, is sort of complaining about the burden of regulation. Itai, thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you very much.
And there's more about ESG companies through our VOD channel, so you're more than invited to have a look. Thank you.